The gavel cracked like a gunshot, and I flinched so hard my attorney grabbed my elbow to steady me. 3 rows behind me, Desmond didn't flinch. I didn't have to turn around to know that. I could feel him sitting there, legs crossed, arm draped over the bench, wearing that charcoal Tom Ford suit and a smile he thought I couldn't see. The Honorable Judge Felton adjusted his bifocals and read from the document in front of him, his voice flat and procedural, the way men sound when they're delivering ruin and calling it justice. The last will and testament of Odessa May Ashford, dated September the 14th, hereby bequeaths the residential property located at 412 Hollow Creek Road in the unincorporated community of Briarfield, Virginia, to her granddaughter, Nyla Renee Ashford. Felton paused. He looked up at me over the rim of his glasses. That is the entirety of the bequest. The courtroom exhaled. Somebody in the gallery whispered. My hands went cold. I looked at the folder in front of me, at the photocopied image of the property I had never visited, a 2-story house with a collapsed porch, boarded windows, and kudzu crawling up the chimney like green fingers trying to pull the whole thing underground. My grandmother, the woman who raised me from the age of 6, who braided my hair and taught me to draft floor plans on graph paper, who built a real estate portfolio worth north of $9 million, had left me a condemned house in a county that didn't even have a stoplight. Everything else, every rental property, every certificate of deposit, every brokerage account, I went into a trust administered by the law firm of Odom and Pruitt, the same firm where my ex-husband Desmond was a founding partner, the same firm where Renata Odom, the woman Desmond had been sleeping with for the last 2 years of our marriage, was the other name on the door. I turned around slowly. I found Desmond's eyes. He tilted his head, the way a person does when they're pretending to feel sorry but can't quite hide the satisfaction underneath. He mouthed 2 words across the courtroom. Tough break. Hi, viewers. Before we go any deeper into this story, I want to ask you something real. Have you ever trusted someone with your whole heart and later found out they were playing you the entire time? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to hear your story. Outside the courthouse, the October air bit through my thin blazer. I stood on the steps, holding the rusted key the clerk had handed me in a manila envelope. It was heavy, black iron with teeth that looked hand-cut. My attorney, a public defender named Gail Hobson, who had taken the case as a favor, stood beside me. Nyla, I have to be honest with you, Gail said, pulling her coat tighter. I reviewed the trust documents twice. Desmond's firm drafted the amendment to your grandmother's will 11 days before she died. The original will left you everything. This version routes it all through a trust that Desmond controls. I stared at the key. She was on morphine. She had stage 4 pancreatic cancer. She couldn't even hold a pen. I know, Gail said, but the witnesses on the amendment are a notary from Desmond's office and a hospice nurse who no longer works at the facility. In contesting it would take 2 years and $100,000 you don't have. So he wins. He wins the battle, Gail corrected. But you have the house. And Nyla, your grandmother, chose to leave you that house in both versions of the will, the original and the amended one. Desmond changed everything else, but he left the house alone. Because it's worthless, I said. Maybe, Gail said. Or maybe he didn't think it mattered. I drove south out of Richmond with the windows down because the heat in my 12-year-old Nissan hadn't worked since March. I had $42 in my checking account. I had a duffel bag in the trunk with 3 days of clothes. And I had a positive pregnancy test folded inside my wallet that I had taken 6 days ago in the bathroom of the shelter where I'd been sleeping since Desmond changed the locks on our condo, 12 weeks along. He didn't know. I intended to keep it that way. The GPS lost signal 20 minutes past the last gas station. The paved road turned to gravel, then to packed dirt with grass growing down the center. The trees closed in overhead, oak and hickory so thick the afternoon light went gray. I passed a hand-painted sign that read Briarfield with an arrow pointing left, and another sign beneath it, newer, corporate, that read Future Site of Meridian Luxury Estates, a Pruitt Odom development. I slammed the brakes. I sat in the middle of the dirt road, engine idling, staring at that sign. Pruitt Odom, Desmond's company. Building luxury homes on land that bordered my grandmother's property. The coincidence landed in my gut like a stone dropped into still water. I wasn't just inheriting a house. I was standing in the middle of something Desmond needed me out of the way to finish. And my grandmother had put me right in his path. I took my foot off the brake and kept driving. The house at 412 Hollow Creek Road sat at the end of a quarter-mile driveway, choked with wild blackberry and fallen branches. But I hadn't found the house yet. I hadn't seen what was waiting behind the basement door. And I had no idea that in exactly 72 hours, Desmond Pruitt would send men to this property with orders to make sure I left Briarfield and never came back.
The house rose out of the tree line like something the earth was trying to swallow. Nyla killed the engine and sat behind the wheel for a full minute, just looking. It was a Craftsman, or it had been once. 2 stories of cedar shake siding gone silver with age, a wraparound porch that sagged on the left side like a broken jaw, and a stone chimney split down the middle with a crack wide enough to fit her hand. Every window on the first floor was boarded with plywood. The second-floor windows were bare, and one of them had a curtain still hanging, faded yellow, moving in the breeze like a slow wave from someone who had been waiting a long time. She stepped out of the car. The smell hit her immediately. Wet earth, rotting wood, wild honeysuckle so thick it was almost nauseating. Somewhere behind the house, water was running, a creek or a spring. The only other sound was the wind through the trees and the ticking of her cooling engine. No traffic, no neighbors, no cell signal. She was alone with the house. Nyla pulled the iron key from her pocket and walked toward the porch. The first step groaned under her weight, but held. The second step cracked. She tested each one before committing, the way her grandmother had taught her to walk across construction sites as a child. Always test the floor before you trust it, Odessa used to say. A house will tell you where it's hurting if you listen. The front door was solid oak, warped but intact. The lock was rusted, and the key didn't want to turn. She put both hands on it, leaned her weight in, and twisted. Something inside the mechanism gave way with a metallic screech, and the door swung inward. The air that came out was cold. Not damp cold, not basement cold. It was the dry, controlled cold of a space that had been sealed and maintained. That made no sense. A condemned house with no power should have been sweltering in the Virginia heat, or at least stale and humid. This air had been filtered. Nyla stepped inside. The hallway was dark except for thin blades of light cutting through the boarded windows. Dust hung in the beams like suspended snow. The wallpaper was peeling in long curls, revealing horsehair plaster beneath. To her left, a staircase climbed into shadow. Straight ahead, the hallway opened into what she guessed was the kitchen. To her right was a living room with a stone fireplace and furniture draped in white sheets. She pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam swept across the room and landed on the mantelpiece. There was nothing on it except a single framed photograph and an envelope propped against it. Nyla walked closer. The photograph showed a young black woman in a hard hat standing on a construction site, hands on her hips, grinning at the camera. The woman was maybe 30. She was standing in front of the skeleton of a building, steel beams rising behind her. Written on the back of the frame in permanent marker were the words, Odessa May Ashford, first black female structural engineer licensed in the Commonwealth of Virginia, 1971. Nyla had never seen this photograph. Her grandmother had never mentioned being an engineer. She had always described herself as a woman who bought and sold houses. She had never once, in all the years she raised Nyla, told her she had been an engineer. Nyla picked up the envelope. Her name was on the front in her grandmother's handwriting, the letters shaky but deliberate. She tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, lined, torn from a legal pad. Nyla, if you are holding this letter, it means 2 things. 1, I am gone. 2, you were brave enough to come inside instead of selling the key. I need you to understand something. This house is not a punishment. It is the most valuable thing I own, not because of what it's worth on paper, because of what I built underneath it. Go to the basement, move the workbench against the east wall. You will find a door. Behind the door is everything they tried to take from me and everything they will try to take from you. Do not trust Desmond, do not trust Odom, and do not leave this property. Not for any price, not for any threat. What is beneath this house belongs to you. It has always belonged to you. I love you more than I ever had the words for. Now fight. Nyla read it twice. Her hands were shaking. She folded the letter and put it in her back pocket. She looked at the floor. Somewhere beneath her feet, her grandmother had buried something important enough to protect with her dying breath. She heard a truck engine outside. Headlights swept across the boarded windows. Someone was coming up the driveway. Nyla killed her flashlight and pressed her back against the wall. She heard a door slam, boots on gravel, then a voice, old and rough, calling out into the dark. "Whoever's in that house, I got a 12 gauge and I ain't asking twice. Come out where I can see you." Nyla stepped onto the porch with her hands up, the flashlight still in her right hand, pointed at the ground. The headlights of a battered Ford pickup blinded her. Behind the glare, she could make out a figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with a shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. He was old, 70s at least. He wore overalls over a thermal shirt, and his white beard was trimmed close against dark brown skin. His eyes were sharp, assessing, the eyes of a man who had spent a lifetime deciding quickly whether people were worth trusting. "My name is Nyla Ashford," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Odessa Ashford was my grandmother. She left me this house." The shotgun lowered 3 inches. "Odessa's granddaughter." It wasn't a question. He said it the way you confirm something you've been expecting for a long time. "The architect. She told you about me." "Girl, she talked about you every single week for 15 years. He set the shotgun in the truck bed and walked toward the porch. Up close, she could see the deep lines in his face, the careful way he moved, the strength still in his hands. "I'm Cephas Monroe. I live a half-mile up the ridge. Odessa and I were friends for 40 years. She asked me to watch this place after she got sick. Told me somebody would come for it eventually." He looked at the house, then back at Nyla. "She also told me that when you came, the wrong people wouldn't be far behind." Nyla felt the hair on her arms stand up. "What wrong people?" Cephas didn't answer right away. He walked up the porch steps, testing them the same way Nyla had, and looked through the open front door into the dark house. "You read the letter on the mantel?" "Yes." "You find the basement yet?" "I was about to when you showed up." Cephas nodded slowly. "Then let's not waste time. I'll get the generator running. Your grandmother had me install a new one last spring. Cost her $8,000 for a house she said was worthless." He gave Nyla a look that said everything his words didn't. "I'll be around back." 3 minutes later, the generator hummed to life and the overhead lights flickered on, dim and yellow, but enough to see. The house looked worse in the light. Water stains on the ceiling, holes in the plaster, mouse droppings along the baseboards. But the bones were solid. Nyla could feel it in the way the floor held her weight, in the way the walls met the ceiling at true angles. This house had been built by someone who understood structure, someone like an engineer. She found the basement stairs behind a door in the kitchen. The stairs were concrete, not wood, which was unusual for a house this old. At the bottom, a single bare bulb lit a low-ceilinged room filled with what looked like decades of stored junk. Old furniture, boxes of canning jars, a rusted bicycle. And against the east wall, exactly where her grandmother's letter said it would be, a heavy wooden workbench bolted to the floor. Nyla grabbed one end and pulled. It didn't move. She crouched down and looked at the bolts. They weren't rusted. They were clean, oiled, and they had quick-release latches disguised to look like standard hex bolts. Her grandmother had designed this. Nyla flipped the latches. The workbench rolled forward on hidden casters, smooth and silent, revealing a steel door set flush into the concrete wall. There was no handle, no keyhole, just a recessed panel with a small screen that glowed faint blue when the workbench cleared it. The screen displayed 4 words. "Place hand here, Nyla." She pressed her palm against the screen. A soft click, a hiss of pressurized air. The steel door swung inward on hydraulic hinges, and cold, clean air rushed past her face. Fluorescent lights activated automatically inside, one row after another, illuminating a room that should not have existed beneath a condemned house in rural Virginia. It was a vault. Reinforced concrete walls, climate-controlled air, dehumidifiers humming in the corners. The room was at least 800 square feet. Along the left wall, floor-to-ceiling shelving held dozens of archival boxes, each labeled with dates spanning from 1968 to 2024. Along the right wall, a row of filing cabinets stood beside a desk with a computer monitor and an external hard drive. In the center of the room, on a steel table, sat a wooden chest with brass fittings and a combination lock. But what stopped Nyla cold, what made her reach for the doorframe to keep herself upright, was the wall directly ahead. It was covered, floor to ceiling, with photographs, documents, maps, and handwritten notes connected by colored string. It looked like a detective's caseboard from a crime thriller. And in the center of the web, circled in red marker, was a photograph of Desmond Pruitt shaking hands with a man Nyla had never seen. Beneath the photograph, in her grandmother's handwriting, were 3 words that turned Nyla's blood to ice water. "He married you for the land." Nyla stood in front of that wall, and the ground shifted beneath everything she had believed for the last 8 years of her life. Every memory reorganized itself. Every kindness Desmond had ever shown her recalibrated into calculation. She wasn't ready for what else was in those boxes. She wasn't ready for the documents that would prove her grandmother had been fighting a war for 50 years. But the clock was already running. Somewhere on the other side of these woods, Desmond Pruitt was making phone calls. And the bulldozers were already on their way. Nyla pulled the first archival box from the shelf. It was labeled 1968 to 1972, Acquisition. Inside were documents preserved in acid-free sleeves, each one cataloged with a small index card in her grandmother's precise handwriting. The first document was a deed of sale, dated March 15, 1968. Odessa May Ashford had purchased 47 acres of land in Briarfield, Virginia for $1,200. The seller was listed as the Commonwealth of Virginia, Department of Surplus Lands. A handwritten note on the index card read, "They sold it because they thought it was worthless. Swampland and rock. They didn't test what was underneath." Nyla pulled the next sleeve. It was a geological survey dated 1971, conducted by the Virginia Department of Mines. The survey showed that the Briarfield property sat on top of one of the largest deposits of lithium-bearing pegmatite in the eastern United States. Lithium, the element that powered every electric car battery, every phone, every laptop on the planet. A resource that countries were going to war over. And Odessa Ashford had been sitting on a mountain of it since 1968. Nyla sat down on the concrete floor. She read the next document. It was a letter from a mining company called Meridian Resources, dated 1989, offering to purchase the mineral rights to the property for $300,000. Odessa had written no across the letter in red ink. The next letter was from the same company, dated 1991, offering $1.2 million. No. Another letter, 1995, offering $4 million. No. The offers kept climbing. By 2005, Meridian Resources was offering $22 million for the mineral rights alone, not even the land. And then the letters stopped being polite. Nyla pulled a folder labeled Threats. Inside were copies of certified letters from attorneys representing Meridian Resources, warning of eminent domain proceedings, environmental liability claims, and tax liens. There were photographs of men parked on the road outside the property, taken from the upstairs window of this very house. There were transcripts of voicemails, typed out word for word, each one more aggressive than the last. And at the bottom of the folder was a newspaper clipping from the Briarfield County Register, dated 2012. Local property owner Odessa Ashford defeats eminent domain claim in landmark ruling. Her grandmother had fought them for decades, alone, and she had won. But the next box changed everything. It was labeled 2016 to 2024, Infiltration. Nyla opened it and found a photograph of Desmond Pruitt standing outside the Meridian Resources corporate office in Arlington. He was 28 in the photograph, wearing a suit that was cheaper than the ones he wore now, shaking hands with a silver-haired man identified on the back as Vance Hargrove, CEO, Meridian Resources. Beneath the photograph was a corporate filing showing that Desmond Pruitt had been hired as outside counsel for Meridian Resources in January 2016, 8 months before he walked into the architecture firm where Nyla worked, 8 months before he asked her to coffee, complimented her drawings, told her she had the most beautiful mind he had ever encountered. 8 months before the courtship that felt like fate but was engineered like a hostile takeover. Nyla's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the documents. She kept reading. Her grandmother had documented everything. Phone records showing Desmond calling Meridian's legal department the same week he proposed to Nyla. Emails between Desmond and Renata Odom discussing the Ashford acquisition timeline. A memo from Desmond to Vance Hargrove dated 3 months after the wedding that read, "Marriage secured. Grandmother is elderly and in declining health. Once she passes, Nyla inherits the property. I will ensure the mineral rights are transferred to Meridian through the trust structure we discussed. Estimated timeline, 2 to 5 years. He had married her to steal her land. The entire relationship, 7 years of her life, the morning coffee he made her, the way he rubbed her shoulders after long days, the apartment they chose together, the plans they made, all of it was a transaction. She was the product. The land was the price." Nyla set the documents down. She pressed her palms flat against the cold concrete floor and breathed. She breathed until the ringing in her ears stopped. She breathed until her vision cleared. She breathed until the nausea that had nothing to do with pregnancy passed, and what was left was something harder, something with edges. Cephas's boots appeared at the vault door. He had come down the stairs quietly. He stood in the doorway, looking at Nyla on the floor, surrounded by 50 years of evidence, and he didn't say a word. He just waited. "He never loved me," Nyla said. Her voice was flat, steady. The tears were gone. Something else had taken their place. "No," Cephas said. "He didn't. My grandmother knew. She knew the whole time. She knew before you met him. She tried to warn you. You were young and in love, and she couldn't make you hear it without losing you. So she did the next best thing. She built this room. She collected the evidence. She made sure that when the truth came out, you'd have the weapons to fight back." Nyla stood up. She looked at the wall of photographs and documents, at the red string connecting Desmond to Meridian to Renata, to the county zoning board, to a judge whose name she recognized from the courtroom where her grandmother's will had been read. The corruption ran through Briarfield like roots under a sidewalk, invisible until you knew where to look. Cephas, that sign on the road, Pruitt Odom Development, Meridian Luxury Estates, how far along is the project? Cephas leaned against the doorframe. They broke ground on the eastern parcel 2 months ago, but they can't build the main resort without access to water, and the only viable water source on this side of the ridge runs through your 47 acres. They need your land, Nyla. Without it, the whole project dies. How much is it worth? All of it. The land, the lithium, the water rights. Cephas was quiet for a moment. Your grandmother had it appraised privately in 2022. The lithium deposit alone was valued at roughly $340 million. The water rights, the timber, the development potential of the acreage. Another $60 million on top of that. Conservative estimate, $400 million, sitting beneath a house that Desmond Pruitt had dismissed as a worthless pile of rot. Sitting beneath a house he had left in Nyla's name because taking it would have raised questions, and because he planned to take it later, quietly, through the trust he controlled. But he didn't know about the vault. He didn't know about the evidence. He didn't know that Odessa Ashford had spent the last 8 years of her life building a case against him so airtight that no amount of money or legal maneuvering could crack it open. And he didn't know that in exactly 48 hours, he was going to drive to this property himself, expecting to find a broken woman in a broken house ready to sign away everything. What he was going to find instead was a woman who finally understood exactly what she was worth. The knock on the front door came at 7 in the morning. Nyla had been awake since 4, sitting at the desk in the vault, reading files by the blue-white glow of the computer monitor. She had barely slept. The cot Cephas had brought over from his cabin smelled like cedar and old wool, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw Desmond's face on their wedding day, the way he had held her hands and promised forever, knowing the whole time that forever meant until the land was his. She climbed the ladder out of the vault, slid the workbench back into position, and walked through the kitchen to the front door. Through the gap in the plywood over the living room window, she could see a white Lincoln Navigator parked behind her Nissan, and the woman standing on the porch in a camel-colored cashmere coat and heels that were already sinking into the soft wood. Renata Odom. Nyla opened the door. Renata was exactly the way Nyla remembered her from the one time Desmond had brought her to a dinner party. Tall, angular, with cheekbones that could cut paper, and eyes that calculated the value of everything they landed on. She was holding a leather portfolio and a Starbucks cup, as though this were a Tuesday morning client meeting and not an ambush on a condemned porch in the middle of nowhere. "Nyla," Renata said, smiling with her mouth only, "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. You drove 4 hours to a house with no running water at 7 in the morning. I think we both know what kind of time this is." Renata's smile tightened. She looked past Nyla into the dark hallway, her eyes sweeping the interior with the professional assessment of a woman who dealt in property. "Can I come in? I have something I think you'll want to hear." "You can talk from the porch." Renata opened the leather portfolio and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "Desmond asked me to bring you this. It's a purchase offer for the property. $250,000. Cash. We can close in 48 hours. Nyla didn't touch the paper. "Last week he offered me nothing. Now it's $250,000. That's a big jump for a pile of rot." We reassessed. The land has some development potential. Not much, but enough to make a fair offer. Desmond wants to help you, Nyla. He feels terrible about how the will situation played out. Desmond has never felt terrible about anything in his life that didn't cost him money. Renata's jaw clenched. She set the paper on the porch railing. $250 is generous. This house is condemned. The county is going to cite you for code violations within the month. You'll be paying fines you can't afford on a property you can't live in. Take the money. Start over somewhere else." Nyla stepped forward. She was close enough to smell Renata's perfume, something floral and expensive, layered over the faint chemical smell of dry cleaning. She looked directly into Renata's eyes. "Tell Desmond I said no." "Nyla, be reasonable. Tell him I said no to the money. Tell him I said no to leaving. And tell him I know about Meridian Resources." The Starbucks cup trembled in Renata's hand. It was small, barely a quarter-inch of movement, but Nyla caught it. "I don't know what you're talking about," Renata said, but her voice had changed. The polish was cracking. "Tell him I know he was hired as outside counsel for Meridian in January 2016. Tell him I know about the memo he sent to Vance Hargrove 3 months after our wedding. Tell him I know the entire marriage was a land acquisition strategy." Nyla paused. She let the silence do the work. "And tell him my grandmother knew too. For years, she documented everything." Renata's face went rigid. The professional composure didn't crack so much as freeze, like a screen that had stopped processing. She stared at Nyla for a long 5 seconds, and in that silence, Nyla watched something shift behind Renata's eyes. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was the recognition that the math had changed. "You're making a mistake," Renata said quietly. "No, I made a mistake when I married him. This is the correction. Renata picked up the purchase offer from the railing, slid it back into her portfolio, and walked down the porch steps without another word. She got into the Navigator, reversed down the driveway too fast, and disappeared into the tree line. Nyla watched the dust settle. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. She gripped the porch railing and realized her hands were wet with sweat. Cephas appeared from around the side of the house, where he had been standing out of sight with his arms folded. She's going to call him before she hits the main road. I know. And he's going to come himself next time, or he's going to send someone worse. I know that too. Cephas studied her face. You sure about this? You could take the money, disappear, raise that baby somewhere nobody knows your name. Nyla looked at the house, at the sagging porch and the cracked chimney and the yellow curtain still waving in the upstairs window. This house where her grandmother had fought alone for 50 years. This house that held the evidence of every lie Desmond had ever told. This house that was worth $400 million and looked like it wasn't worth the match to burn it down. My grandmother didn't build that vault so I could run, Nyla said. She built it so I could stand. Cephas nodded. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his overalls. Then you're going to need this. Name's Thelma Craddock, retired civil rights attorney out of Charlottesville. She represented your grandmother in the eminent domain case. She's 76 years old, mean as a cottonmouth, and she has been waiting for this phone call for 3 years. Nyla took the paper. She went inside to the one spot in the house where, if she leaned out the upstairs bathroom window at exactly the right angle, she could get 1 bar of cell signal. She dialed the number. A woman answered on the second ring. Her voice was deep, unhurried, and carried the particular weight of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms and had stopped being impressed by anything except the truth. This is Thelma Craddock. Ms. Craddock, my name is Nyla Ashford. Odessa Ashford was my grandmother. A long pause, then a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been the striking of a match. Baby girl, Thelma said, I have been waiting for you. How fast can you get to my office? How fast do I need to? Yesterday, Desmond Pruitt filed a motion this morning to have you declared mentally unfit to manage property. The hearing is in 72 hours. And honey, the judge he filed it with is on Meridian's payroll. Nyla gripped the phone. 72 hours. 3 days to stop a man who had spent 8 years planning this, who had the courts, the money, and the system on his side. 3 days to prove that a woman living in a condemned house with $42 to her name was the rightful owner of a fortune buried under her feet. She looked down at the floor. Somewhere beneath the rotting boards and the hidden vault, $340 million worth of lithium sat in the earth like a held breath. I'll be there in 2 hours, Nyla said. Bring everything your grandmother left you. Every document, every photograph, every receipt. There's a lot. Good, Thelma said, and this time Nyla was sure it was a laugh. I like a lot. The more evidence they buried, the deeper the grave they dug for themselves. Drive fast, baby girl. The clock is ticking, and these people don't play fair. But then again, neither did your grandmother, and neither will I. Nyla hung up. She went downstairs, moved the workbench, opened the vault, and started loading boxes into her car. She didn't know yet that Desmond had already hired a private security firm to watch the property. She didn't know that Renata had placed a call, not just to Desmond, but to Vance Hargrove himself. She didn't know that by tomorrow morning, 3 men in a black Suburban would be parked at the end of Hollow Creek Road, waiting for her to leave. But she also didn't know, not yet, that her grandmother had planned for that too. The last box in the vault, the one Nyla hadn't opened yet, was labeled with 2 words in red ink. Nuclear option. Thelma Craddock's office was above a barbershop on East Main Street in Charlottesville, and the staircase smelled like Murray's pomade and old cigarettes. Nyla carried the first box through the narrow door and set it on a desk buried under case files, coffee rings, and a framed photograph of Thelma shaking hands with Thurgood Marshall. Thelma herself was sitting in a cracked leather chair behind the desk, reading glasses perched on her nose, a menthol cigarette burning in an ashtray she clearly wasn't supposed to have. She was small, barely 5'2", with silver hair cropped close to her scalp and hands that moved with the precision of a woman who had spent 50 years flipping through depositions at speed. "Set the rest by the window," Thelma said without looking up. She was already reading the first document Nyla had placed on the desk, the 1968 deed of sale. "Your grandmother bought this land for $1,200. You know what an acre of lithium-bearing land in Virginia is worth right now?" Cephas said the total valuation was around $340 million. Cephas is being conservative. The lithium market has tripled since that appraisal. We're looking at closer to $500 million if the deposit is as deep as the geological survey suggests. Thelma set the deed down and finally looked at Nyla. Her eyes were brown, steady, and carried the kind of patience that comes from watching powerful men make the same mistakes for decades. "Now tell me about the motion Desmond filed." Nyla sat down across from her. "He's trying to have me declared mentally unfit to manage property. The hearing is in 72 hours. "I know. I pulled the filing an hour ago. He's using a psychiatrist named Dr. Wendell Cage, who will testify that you're suffering from acute grief psychosis and are incapable of making sound financial decisions. Dr. Cage has never examined you. He's never spoken to you, but he has billed Meridian Resources for consulting work, totaling $180,000 over the last 4 years. Nyla felt her stomach drop. They bought a psychiatrist. They bought a psychiatrist, a judge, and half the zoning board. Your grandmother documented all of it. That's why she built that vault, Nyla. She knew that when the time came, the fight wouldn't be fair. So she made sure you'd have enough ammunition to make it unfair in the other direction." Thelma opened the second box and pulled out a thick manila folder. "This is the one that matters. Your grandmother titled it Project Blackthorn. Inside is every wire transfer, every email, every recorded phone call between Desmond Pruitt, Renata Odom, and Vance Hargrove at Meridian Resources. 14 years of documented conspiracy to defraud you out of your inheritance. Can we use it in court? Some of it. The recordings are tricky because Virginia is a one-party consent state, but your grandmother was a party to several of these conversations. The financial records are bulletproof. The emails were obtained through a forensic data recovery firm your grandmother hired in 2021 when Desmond accidentally left his laptop at her house during a visit." Thelma almost smiled. "Accidentally. Your grandmother was something else. What about the will, the amendment that gave everything to the trust?" Thelma leaned back. "That's where we start. I've already retained a handwriting analyst and a forensic document examiner. The signature on the amended will doesn't match your grandmother's known handwriting from the same period. The notary who witnessed it, a woman named Shayla Ricks, is currently employed by Odom and Pruitt. And the hospice nurse who co-witnessed it, a man named Franklin Tubbs, received a wire transfer of $25,000 from Desmond's personal account 3 days after the will was signed." She placed the evidence on the desk, one document after another, like a dealer laying cards face up. "We don't just have a case, Nyla. We have a prosecution. The question is whether we play defense first and stop the competency hearing, or whether we go on offense and file criminal charges before they know what hit them." "What would my grandmother do?" Thelma took a long drag of her cigarette. "Your grandmother would do both at the same time and make them think she was doing neither. She was the most strategic woman I ever met. She played chess while everyone around her was playing checkers." Thelma crushed the cigarette. "So here's what we're going to do. Tomorrow morning, I'm filing a motion to disqualify Judge Waverly from the competency hearing on the grounds of financial conflict of interest. I have his Meridian consulting payments documented. That buys us time. While they scramble to find a new judge, we file a separate action to invalidate the amended will on grounds of fraud, undue influence, and forgery. And simultaneously, I'm sending the criminal evidence to the FBI's Public Corruption Unit in Richmond." The FBI. Desmond didn't just steal your inheritance, Nyla. He conspired with a corporation to manipulate a dying woman's estate through forged documents and bribed officials. That's federal wire fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy. The FBI has been looking at Meridian Resources for 2 years because of their land acquisition practices in Appalachia. Your grandmother's files are the missing piece they need. Nyla stared at the stacks of evidence covering every surface of the small office. Her grandmother had spent years building this arsenal, knowing she wouldn't live to use it. Knowing that the responsibility would fall to the granddaughter Desmond thought he had already beaten. "There's one more thing," Nyla said. She pulled the last folder from the bottom of the box. The one labeled nuclear option in red ink. She hadn't opened it yet. She placed it on the desk between them. Thelma looked at the label. She looked at Nyla. She opened the folder. Inside was a single USB drive and a typed letter from Odessa. Thelma read the letter aloud, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. "Thelma, if Nyla has brought you this folder, it means the situation has escalated beyond the courts. The USB drive contains a recorded conversation between Desmond Pruitt and Vance Hargrove from November 2022. In this recording, they discuss accelerating the timeline for acquiring the Briarfield property by, and I quote, making sure the old woman's medication gets adjusted. Use this only if they corner you. This is the kill shot. They discussed poisoning me, Thelma, and I have them on tape." The room went completely silent. Nyla couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. The words on that page rearranged everything she thought she knew about her grandmother's death. Odessa hadn't just died of cancer. Somebody had helped the cancer along. Thelma set the letter down with hands that were perfectly steady. She looked at Nyla with an expression that was equal parts fury and professional calculation. "Your grandmother didn't just leave you a house, baby girl. She left you a grenade with the pin already pulled. The question now is where we throw it." She picked up her phone. "I need to make a call. You need to eat something and get some rest. Because starting tomorrow morning, Desmond Pruitt's entire world is going to collapse. And I need you standing tall when it does." Nyla nodded. She stood up, walked to the window, and looked down at the street below. Somewhere out there, Desmond was eating dinner, checking his portfolio, maybe laughing with Renata about the crazy woman living in a shack. He had no idea what was coming. He had no idea that the woman he had underestimated, the grandmother he had tried to poison, and the granddaughter he had married for profit, had built a trap so precise and so patient that by the time he felt it close around him, there would be nowhere left to run. Nyla pressed her hand against her stomach. 12 weeks, a heartbeat inside a heartbeat. She whispered to the window, to the night, to the grandmother who couldn't hear her anymore. "I'm going to finish what you started." The black Suburban was parked at the end of Hollow Creek Road at 6 in the morning. Nyla spotted it from a quarter-mile away as she drove back from Charlottesville with the boxes reloaded in her trunk. 2 men sat in the front seats. They weren't trying to hide. They wanted her to see them. She slowed down, memorized the plate number, and drove past them without stopping. In her rear-view mirror, she saw the passenger lift the phone to his ear. Cephas was waiting on the porch when she pulled up. He had his shotgun leaning against the railing and a thermos of coffee in his hand. "2 men at the bottom of the road," he said. "Been there since 4. I walked down to check. Virginia plates. Rental sticker on the bumper. Security firm out of D.C. called Apex Protective Services. Meridian's people. Or Desmond's. Same difference at this point. They're not here to do anything yet. They're here to watch. To make you nervous. To make you feel like a woman alone in the woods with no one coming to help." "Then they miscounted," Nyla said, "because I'm not alone." That afternoon, Nyla did something her grandmother's letter hadn't told her to do. She drove into the town of Briarfield, which consisted of a gas station, a post office, a Baptist church, and a general store run by a woman named Cornelia Vickers, who had lived in the area for 60 years. Nyla walked into the store, bought a bottle of water, and introduced herself. "You're Odessa's girl," Cornelia said immediately. She was a sturdy woman with gray braids and reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain. "Lord, I've been wondering when you'd show up." Your grandmother told me to expect you. She said when you came, it would mean the fight was starting. What fight? Cornelia looked at her over the glasses. Honey, everyone in Briarfield knows about Meridian. They've been buying up land parcels for 6 years, offering people 3 times market value, which sounds generous until you find out what the land is actually worth. 14 families have sold. The ones who didn't sell got their wells contaminated, their fences cut, their livestock spooked. One family, the Bedfords, their barn burned down, and the fire marshal called it electrical. The Bedfords didn't have electricity in that barn. They're terrorizing people off their land. They're doing what corporations have always done to black communities in rural Virginia. They take what they want and call it progress. Your grandmother was the only one who fought back, and when she won the eminent domain case, Meridian realized they couldn't take the land legally, so they found another way in. Cornelia paused. They found Desmond. Nyla spent the next 2 hours at Cornelia's kitchen table behind the store. She met 4 other landowners who had been pressured by Meridian. Each one had a story. Lowball offers followed by threats. Zoning changes that made their properties unbuildable. Tax assessments that tripled overnight. Environmental citations for violations that didn't exist. The pattern was identical every time. Meridian would squeeze until the owner sold or gave up. My grandmother fought alone for 50 years, Nyla said. She shouldn't have had to. She didn't want to involve anyone else, Cornelia said. She was protecting us. She knew that if Meridian found out the community was organized, they'd come down harder. So she took the hits herself. I'm not my grandmother, Nyla said. I'm not going to fight alone, and I'm not going to play defense. She pulled out a copy of the geological survey from her bag. She spread it on the table. She showed them the lithium deposit, the water rights, the true value of the land they had been pressured to sell for pennies. The room went quiet. Cornelia removed her reading glasses and pressed her hand over her mouth. A man named Booker Tate, whose family had farmed 40 acres adjacent to Nyla's property for 3 generations, stood up from the table and walked to the window. He stood there for a long time, looking out at the land his grandfather had cleared by hand. They offered me $60,000 for my parcel, Booker said, his voice thick. I almost took it. I was 3 days from signing. Don't sign anything, Nyla said. Not yet. I have a lawyer, the best one in Virginia, and I have evidence that Meridian has been committing fraud, bribery, and coercion across this entire county. We're going to the FBI, but I need witnesses. I need people willing to testify about what Meridian did to their properties, their families, their lives. The room was silent. Then Cornelia stood up. I'll testify. My late husband's cousin worked for the county assessor's office. He told me before he died that someone from Meridian paid the assessor to inflate property taxes on every black-owned parcel in Briarfield. I have his written statement in my safe deposit box. Booker turned from the window. I'll testify, and I'll bring the Bedford family. Their barn didn't burn itself down. One by one, the people in that kitchen stood and agreed. By the time Nyla left Cornelia's store, she had 7 witnesses and a community that had been fractured by fear but was now pulling itself back together around a common purpose. She drove back to the property as the sun was setting. The Suburban was still parked at the end of the road. But this time, as she passed, she stopped her car and rolled down the window. The passenger looked at her surprised. She held up her phone. She took a photograph of the vehicle, the plate, and both men's faces. Then she smiled, rolled the window up, and drove on. The phone on the passenger's lap buzzed. A text from Desmond Pruitt. Is she cracking yet? The man looked at his partner. He looked back at the road where Nyla's taillights were disappearing into the trees. He typed back. No, she's not cracking. She's organizing. The courtroom in Briarfield County was small, overheated, and smelled like floor wax and anxiety. Nyla sat at the defendant's table in a navy dress she had bought at the thrift store in Charlottesville, her hands folded, her back straight. Thelma Craddock sat beside her, a stack of files 2 inches thick organized with colored tabs. Thelma looked like she was about to enjoy herself. Desmond sat across the aisle. He was wearing a charcoal suit, gold cufflinks, and the expression of a man who expected to win. Beside him sat Renata Odom and a team of 3 attorneys from one of Richmond's largest firms. Behind them, in the gallery, sat Vance Hargrove, CEO of Meridian Resources. He was 70, silver-haired, and sat with the relaxed posture of a man who had never lost a fight because he had always chosen fights he could buy. The new judge, Judge Althea Redmond, had been assigned after Thelma's motion disqualified Judge Waverly. Redmond was from Norfolk. She had no ties to Briarfield, no financial relationship with Meridian, and a reputation for being allergic to corruption. Desmond's team had fought the reassignment for 2 days and lost. Judge Redmond opened the proceedings. This court has been asked to determine the mental competency of Miss Nyla Ashford to manage her own property. Petitioner, present your case. Desmond's lead attorney, a tall man named Gifford Price, stood up and began. He was smooth. He was polished. He described Nyla as a grieving woman suffering from delusions, living in a condemned house without running water, refusing reasonable offers for a property she couldn't maintain. He called Dr. Wendell Cage to the stand. Cage testified that, based on behavioral indicators and third-party reports, Nyla exhibited signs of acute grief psychosis, impaired judgment, and possible paranoid ideation. Thelma didn't object during any of it. She sat quietly, making notes with a fountain pen. When it was her turn to cross-examine, she stood up slowly, adjusted her glasses, and walked to the witness box like a woman taking a Sunday stroll. Dr. Cage, you testified that my client suffers from grief psychosis. Have you ever met my client? I have reviewed comprehensive behavioral reports. That's not what I asked. Have you met her, spoken with her, examined her? Not directly, no, but standard practice allows for. Have you ever set foot in Briarfield County? I have not. Interesting. Now, Dr. Cage, you mentioned you're a consulting psychiatrist. Can you tell the court who your primary consulting client has been for the past 4 years? Cage's eyes darted to Desmond's table. I provide services to various organizations. Let me help you remember. Thelma held up a billing statement. Meridian Resources, $182,000 in consulting fees since 2021. Isn't that correct? I provide general wellness consulting to their executive team. General Wellness Consulting. And is Vance Hargrove, the CEO of Meridian Resources, currently sitting in this courtroom? Every head in the gallery turned to look at Hargrove. He didn't move. His expression didn't change. But his right hand, resting on his knee, closed into a fist. Your Honor, Thelma said, turning to the bench. The petitioner's expert witness has a direct financial relationship with the corporation that has been attempting to acquire my client's land for decades. He has never examined my client. His testimony is bought, not earned, and I move to have it stricken. Stricken, Judge Redmond said without hesitation. She turned to Desmond's attorneys. Is that all you have? Price stood up. Your Honor, we also have testimony regarding the condition of the property and Miss Ashford's refusal to. Miss Ashford's refusal to sell her own property is her constitutional right, Counselor. Do you have any medical evidence from a physician who has actually examined this woman? Silence. Price looked at Desmond. Desmond's jaw was clenched so tight that a vein throbbed at his temple. No, Your Honor. Then the petition for mental incompetency is denied. Redmond banged her gavel. And Mr. Pruitt, I'd advise your team to think very carefully before bringing another filing like this into my courtroom. The gallery buzzed. Desmond stood up, buttoning his jacket with sharp, furious movements. He looked at Nyla. For the first time since she had known him, the mask was gone. The charm, the polish, the practiced warmth, all of it had evaporated. What was left was the face of a man who had been outplayed and knew it. Nyla looked back at him. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just held his gaze until he looked away. But the hearing wasn't over. Thelma remained standing. "Your Honor, if the court will indulge me, I have a counter motion to file." Redmond raised an eyebrow. "Proceed." The defense moves to invalidate the amended last will and testament of Odessa May Ashford on the grounds of fraud, forgery, and undue influence. We have forensic handwriting analysis showing the signature on the amendment does not match Mrs. Ashford's known hand. We have financial records showing payments to the witnesses of the amended will from accounts controlled by the petitioner. And we have documentary evidence that the petitioner, Desmond Pruitt, was acting as an agent of Meridian Resources at the time he married my client, with the express purpose of acquiring her family's land through matrimonial fraud. The courtroom erupted. Reporters in the back row were typing frantically. Hargrove stood up and walked out without a word. Desmond grabbed Renata's arm and leaned in, whispering something that made her face go white. Judge Redmond restored order. She accepted Thelma's filing and scheduled a full evidentiary hearing for 30 days. Then she looked directly at Desmond. "Mr. Pruitt, I strongly suggest you retain personal criminal counsel before that hearing date. This court takes fraud allegations very seriously." Desmond walked out of the courtroom without looking at anyone. He climbed into his car, sat behind the wheel, and didn't start the engine for 10 minutes. He had spent 8 years building a trap for Nyla Ashford. He had married her, isolated her from her grandmother, manipulated a dying woman's will, bribed officials, hired surveillance teams, and filed false psychiatric claims. He had done everything right, everything according to the plan that Meridian had laid out and that he had executed with surgical precision. And a woman with $42 and a rusted key had just dismantled it in a single afternoon. The phone in his pocket buzzed. A text from Vance Hargrove. 4 words. "Fix this, or else." Desmond stared at the message. He was running out of moves. And somewhere in the woods of Briarfield, in a house he had dismissed as worthless, Nyla Ashford was just getting started. The FBI arrived at dawn. 3 vehicles, no sirens, no announcement. They pulled up to the offices of Odom and Pruitt in Richmond at 6:45 in the morning, before the receptionist had even turned on the lights. Nyla wasn't there. She didn't need to be. Thelma had submitted the evidence package to the Public Corruption Unit 4 days earlier, and what the FBI found on that USB drive, the recording of Desmond and Vance Hargrove discussing the manipulation of Odessa's medication, had turned a fraud investigation into a potential homicide case. By 9 o'clock, the FBI had seized 14 boxes of files from Desmond's office. By 10, they had frozen every account connected to the trust that controlled Odessa's estate. By noon, a federal warrant had been issued for the arrest of Dr. Wendell Cage on charges of filing fraudulent medical testimony. And by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Vance Hargrove was sitting in a federal interrogation room in Arlington, watching his attorney negotiate the terms of what would become the largest corporate plea deal in Virginia history. Hargrove gave up everyone. He gave up Desmond. He gave up Renata. He gave up the judge, the zoning commissioner, the notary, and the hospice nurse who had witnessed the forged will. He gave up the names of every official Meridian had paid in Briarfield County for the past 20 years. He gave up the details of the scheme to acquire the lithium deposits through matrimonial fraud. And when the FBI asked him about the recorded conversation regarding Odessa's medication, Hargrove went pale and asked for a glass of water. "That was Desmond's idea," Hargrove said, his voice cracking. "I never authorized any direct action against the old woman. Desmond said he would handle it. He said he knew someone at the hospice facility. I told him I didn't want to know the details." The FBI agent across the table didn't blink. "But you knew the intent." "I knew the timeline was being accelerated. I knew Desmond wanted the grandmother to die sooner rather than later. I assumed he meant naturally. I chose not to ask questions." That's called willful blindness, Mr. Hargrove, and in a conspiracy case, it carries the same weight as direct knowledge. Hargrove's attorney leaned in and whispered something. Hargrove nodded. "I'll testify against Desmond. Full cooperation, whatever you need." The arrest happened at 7 the next morning. Nyla was sitting on the porch at Hollow Creek Road, drinking coffee Cephas had made, when her phone rang. It was Thelma. "Turn on the news, baby girl." Nyla went inside and powered up the laptop she had bought with cash from the vault. She found the live stream from WRIC in Richmond. The camera showed the front steps of the federal courthouse. 2 U.S. Marshals walked Desmond Pruitt down the steps in handcuffs. He was wearing the same charcoal suit he had worn to the hearing. His head was down. His hair was uncombed. Renata Odom walked behind him, also in cuffs, her face a mask of controlled fury. The charges scrolled across the bottom of the screen: federal wire fraud, conspiracy to commit elder abuse, conspiracy to commit murder, forgery, bribery of public officials, money laundering, obstruction of justice. Nyla watched the screen. She waited to feel something: triumph, vindication, relief. But what came instead was quieter than any of those. It was exhaustion, the deep, bone-level tiredness of a woman who had been carrying a weight she didn't know she was holding until someone finally took it off her shoulders. Cephas stood in the doorway behind her. He watched the screen in silence. When the broadcast cut to a reporter summarizing the charges, he spoke. "Your grandmother would be proud of you." "My grandmother did the hard part," Nyla said. "She spent 50 years collecting the evidence. She built the vault. She hired Thelma. She set up every piece. All I did was show up." "Showing up was the whole point," Cephas said. "She couldn't force you to come. She couldn't force you to open the letter. She couldn't force you to go down that ladder instead of selling the key and walking away. Every step was your choice, Nyla. She gave you the tools. You swung the hammer." The probate court ruled 6 weeks later. The amended will was declared void on grounds of fraud and forgery. The original will, the one Odessa had written before Desmond's interference, was reinstated. It left everything to Nyla. The rental properties, the certificates of deposit, the brokerage accounts, the land, and the house at 412 Hollow Creek Road. The total estate, once the frozen accounts were released and the fraudulent debts were discharged, was valued at just under $420 million. Nyla didn't move into the Lakeview mansion. She didn't buy a penthouse in Richmond. She stayed in the house at Hollow Creek Road. She hired a contractor, a Black-owned firm out of Charlottesville, to restore the Craftsman to its original condition. They replaced the roof, rebuilt the porch, restored the cedar siding, and fixed the cracked chimney. But Nyla told them to leave one thing untouched: the yellow curtain in the upstairs window, the one that had been waving when she first arrived. "That stays," she said. "It's how my grandmother said hello." 8 months later, Nyla stood on the rebuilt porch of 412 Hollow Creek Road, holding her daughter. The baby was 3 weeks old, with dark eyes that tracked every movement and a grip that could close around a finger and not let go. Nyla had named her Odessa, not because she wanted her daughter to carry a legacy, because she wanted her daughter to carry a name that meant someone who fights. The house was beautiful now. Not flashy, not grand, just solid and warm, the way Craftsman homes were built to be. Rocking chairs on the porch, herbs growing in window boxes, the creek running clear behind the property, audible from the kitchen if you left the window cracked. Inside, the walls held photographs, the one of her grandmother on the construction site in 1971, a new one of Nyla and baby Odessa on the porch, and one of Cephas, standing in the garden with a trowel in one hand and a disapproving look at the camera that made Nyla laugh every time she passed it. The vault was still beneath the house. Nyla had reinforced it, upgraded the security, and added a proper entrance from the outside. But its purpose had changed. It was no longer a bunker. It was an archive. She had partnered with the University of Virginia's History Department to preserve her grandmother's documents as a case study in environmental racism, corporate land theft, and community resistance in rural Appalachia. Graduate students came twice a month to catalog the materials. Odessa Ashford's 50-year battle was becoming part of the public record, which was exactly what a woman who had fought in secret deserved. The lithium deposit remained in the ground. Nyla had received offers from 6 different mining companies, each one larger than the last. She turned them all down. Instead, she formed a land trust with the families of Briarfield. The trust held all 47 acres plus the adjacent parcels that Booker Tate, Cornelia Vickers, and the other families contributed. The terms were simple: no extraction, no development. The land would be conserved, and the families would share in the revenue from sustainable timber and the water rights that Meridian had been so desperate to control. A cooperative water utility now served 3 counties from the aquifer beneath Nyla's property. It was the cleanest water in Virginia. Cornelia ran the general store, which now had a small cafe attached to it that served sweet potato pie good enough to make people drive an hour off the highway. Booker Tate rebuilt his fence line and expanded his farm. The Bedford family received a settlement from Meridian's bankruptcy proceedings to cover the barn that had been burned down. And 14 families who had sold their land under duress were given the option to buy it back at the original price, funded by a foundation Nyla established in her grandmother's name: the Odessa Ashford Foundation for Rural Land Justice. Velma Craddock officially unretired to run the foundation's legal arm. She said she would do it for 1 year. That was 2 years ago. She showed no signs of stopping. Desmond Pruitt was convicted on all counts: federal wire fraud, conspiracy to commit elder abuse, and the charge that carried the most weight: conspiracy to commit murder in connection with the interference in Odessa's end-of-life care. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. The sentencing took 11 minutes. 32 years in federal prison, no possibility of parole for the first 20. Renata Odom received 18 years. Vance Hargrove, in exchange for his cooperation, received 8. Dr. Wendell Cage lost his medical license and received 5 years for filing fraudulent testimony. The notary, Shayla Ricks, received 3. The hospice nurse, Franklin Tubbs, who had co-witnessed the forged will and who the FBI later determined had adjusted Odessa's pain medication dosages on Desmond's instructions, received 20 years. Judge Waverly resigned before his impeachment hearing could begin. The county zoning commissioner left the state. The Briarfield County Register ran a front-page story about the case that was picked up nationally. For 3 weeks, Nyla's face was on every news channel in America. She gave exactly 1 interview to a reporter from the Richmond Free Press. And then she went home to Hollow Creek Road and didn't give another. The reporter had asked her what she wanted people to take away from the story. Nyla had thought about it for a long time before answering. "My grandmother was the smartest person I ever knew," Nyla said. She was a structural engineer when the state of Virginia didn't believe a black woman could read a blueprint. She bought land when everyone told her it was worthless. She fought a corporation for 50 years and she won, over and over, and they still tried to take it from her. They manipulated her will. They poisoned her medication. They married her granddaughter as part of a business deal. And you know what? She planned for all of it. Every single move they made, she had already anticipated and countered. She built a vault under her own house and filled it with enough evidence to bring down an entire corporation. She did that while dying of cancer, while they were isolating her from me, while they thought she was a helpless old woman who didn't understand what was happening. Nyla paused. So what do I want people to take away? Don't underestimate the people you're trying to destroy, because some of them are building something underneath you that you can't see, and by the time you find out, it's too late. Nyla sat on the porch now, watching the sun drop behind the tree line. Baby Odessa was asleep against her chest, breathing the slow, certain rhythm of a child who has never known fear. Cephas was in the garden, arguing with a tomato plant about its growth habits. The creek hummed behind the house. The yellow curtain drifted in the upstairs window. She thought about the day she first drove down Hollow Creek Road with $42 and a rusted key. She thought about the way the house had looked, like something the earth was trying to bury. She thought about her grandmother's letter on the mantel. "This house is not a punishment. It is the most valuable thing I own." Odessa hadn't been talking about the lithium. She hadn't been talking about the vault or the evidence or the water rights. She had been talking about the place where she fell in love, where she built her first walls, where she learned that a woman who understands structure can hold up anything. She had given Nyla the house because it was the one thing in her life that was built on something real. Nyla pressed her lips to the top of her daughter's head. The baby stirred, gripped her finger, and settled back to sleep. "We're home," Nyla whispered. "And nobody's taking this from us. Not ever." If you are watching this and carrying a weight that feels impossible, if someone has taken something from you and made you believe you deserve the loss, remember this. Sometimes the thing that looks like a punishment is actually a gift disguised in dust and ruin. Sometimes the people who hurt you hand you the very thing that will save you because they were too arrogant to see its value. And sometimes the fight you think you're losing is actually the fight your grandmother already won. You just have to show up and open the door. If this story moved you, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. We have something incredible coming next week that will stay with you for days. And if you know someone who is fighting a battle right now, someone who feels alone, someone who is standing in front of a ruined house, wondering if there's anything left inside worth saving, share this story with them. Sometimes all it takes is one story to remind someone that their inheritance is not what was taken from them. It is what remains. And what remains is always enough. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever inherited something that turned out to be worth more than anyone expected? I want to hear your story. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being part of this community. And remember, seeds grow in the dirt. Always have, always will.